Okay, I've been wanting to try to espouse, I guess, I always do this, a sort of a new bout, a new round of ideological uh, contention, sort of like a revised or slightly updated, sort of way to fully encapsulate and pin down, the very nebulous kind of thing that is occurring at the level of ideology in terms of identity consciousness, which is a very pernicious form of structured belief. So, having witnessed some people sort of try go through the barest bones sort of establishment of the theory, as it were, in its simplest form, and also I would say that they were consciously trying to present it in such a way that it doesn't obviously fall prey and prone to racial essentialism and or identity essentialism in that case. And with them trying to accomplish that, it more overtly, I think, underlines the more key functional parts of the ideology, which therefore make it more susceptible to really getting down to what the heart of the error is, which it is fundamentally problematic. It's sort of is based on such a sort of a table thumb, such a they are begging the question on a very basic set of premises which they never talk about, which the whole thing is kind of premised on. And I think it's more natural to just kind of read those premises as racial essentialism, but they can be described in an ulterior fashion, although that doesn't make much difference, I would say. Um, so the fundamental uh, sort of starting point is that you have a narrative in some sense, and this narrative uh, is, in essence, um, it's encapsulated in history, and that history is projected onto the past. And that history is projected onto the present, where the present is seen as correlating in a one-to-one linear correlation with all the features that are part of the historical narrative. And so it is taken that the historical narrative is the correct causal description of explaining everything that happens in the present, is determined by the historical narrative. So the projection of history onto the present is something that I would just generally call that maneuver the causal narrative. And so because this is all definitionally sort of built into the ideology. This isn't ever argued for or established. This is, in some sense, it's established by merely um, talking about the history with the right amount of emotional attachment, and sort of, so that you can see that the person is anchoring their integrity into the historical narrative, and that they are saying that no, it's the history that needs to be sorted out, it's the history that needs to be revised and reacted to, that and obviously the change of that history has to be compensated for after the fact, but it has to have its goal at erasing and changing the history. So it's the historical injustice that becomes the task of the present. And this, I would just, it's a weird set of correlating features, but so I would just sort of lump this in because I think it's more, this is a more authentic way of how the ideology is actually operating, is that it's operating from this idea that everything conflates into this commonly shared causal narrative, and because it's causal, it cannot be opted out of, it cannot be argued out of. And so it's just kind of, it's just, this is just presumed. And so if you try to solicit that causal narrative and deconstruct it and talk about all the things that it cannot address and it doesn't take into account, and how it's a complete diversion from actually dealing with real challenges, it's just, like, usually the answer to this is merely just table thumping the historical narrative and just sort of assuming that it should be taken as causal. And so you get the narrative spoken at you, and that's the end of the kind of engagement. There's no real engagement, there's no real vulnerability or susceptibility of the belief structure. It's completely insulated because it just begs its own it starts from the point at which it's already begged the question, and then it just continues on constantly. It's like a slow motion train wreck. And whether or not these people want to say, so I mean, you could call it like a kind of historical reductionism, but that people are rightfully reduced to their historically assigned roles in terms of their interrelated power dynamics is somewhat evidenced by history. And so it's the historical historically historical wrongs and injustices and limitations and conditions on historical choices then get sort of projected onto all the choices that are capable of being made into the present. And these things are just sort of conflated into a single identity, into a single position. So this position is like coextensive with an unmoved historical thing, which it needs therefore to anchor its identity and ground its identity, and to give it a kind of objective, factual kind of it's weird because it does this without laying out the validity of this kind of it doesn't substantiate why this this identity construction it doesn't have a valid hypothesis for doing these things, but just mentioning the history in an emotional way gives that kind of individual buy-in. Well, I have individually invested this into this is my worldview. I've decided to make this my worldview. And then essentially you have the kind of the postmodern edifice that sort of protects people from doing this, because it's like, well, it's like I'm allowed to create my own religion, aren't I? I'm allowed to create my own framework. So why can't it be historical if that's what I choose it to be? And then essentially, because it's emotionally causative of their immediate present feelings, then that becomes coextensive to all the practical issues and challenges within the context of the present. So the context of the present is emotionally bonded to historical constraints. And so if there were historical constraints that can be rhetorically exploited this way, you've got a kind of a stable, narcissistic, sort of collective enterprise and project that is just trying to regain its standing and redeem its own collective pride, that it just wants to have the same sort of equilibrium with the kind of ill-gotten gains that were, which are also projected onto the historical perpetrators. So there's this idea that injustice is the measure of transferred material well-being. So there are all these very strange equivalent, kind of, so somehow this moral paradigm somehow becomes the medium and the currency within which not only morality is understood, but also how power and it really, it just presumes that there's this kind of this zero sum field of influence, and that, like, wealth is never created, it's only distributed across the system. It really has this built into its basic fabric of, of, again, of its just definitions, because of how identity is statistically and historically reduced uh, and analyzed, in terms of its interpretation. And so it's very strange because it doesn't have any grounding outside of its relative, comparative sort of, you know, the it only works if the only entity of moral consideration that can ever be accepted are identities. So it forces everything to balkanize into the same kind of categorization. So for even one collective or group to sort of encompass this, it has to project that everyone is coextensively doing the same thing, So it's the sort of I used to have an analogy where I talked about essentially that it's very similar to Nazi philosophy, where if you see yourself as kind of like a wolf tribe and a pack of wolves, that because you've given up your humanity, you've given up your reasoning, and you're just a kind of, well, our breed should do better, and we're at war with these other packs. You can't. It kind of forces a kind of escalation, or at least uh, some general movement towards dividing up territory, just so that you don't have to interact with other people who um, are contending um, representation of an identity faction which is trying to reclaim something against the system as a block. So it completely breaks down any kind of common shared set of values. It's just a kind of uh, it's very strange, because I mean, I've mentioned this before, but it's just in the same way that the Nazis complained about the Jews, only then effectively to do everything that they accused the Jews of doing as a mode of defense against the Jewish conspiracy. It's somewhat ironic. Um, that it ends up doing exactly the thing, that it ends up perpetrating exactly the thing that it's complaining about. Um, and he, and but yeah, I wanted to deconstruct some of the kind of the activism, because it really is the form of this sort of activism, which is very strange, because there's never been an activism really that has been so good at facilitating the concentration and centralization of decision making into ad hoc bodies of, of essentially un uh, unmonitored, nodes of administration over society. So it really breaks everything down into this kind of feudal system, really. Um, and it really has a lot of feudal characteristics sort of built into it. And in countries that have better political establishments, you can really see the corroding and corrupting resistance that people have to this kind of activism, because it's so easy that you just you virtue signal, and then you get to be on the right side, and then because you virtue signaled stronger than the other faction, you just get this like you know you don't get these red flags and this kind of misinformation and this kind of rumor mill, working against you, from these, very toxic, yeah, it's interesting as well because when you look at these activists, and I know that this is going to sound ad hominem, but it is actually true. But if you look at the faces of these kinds of activists, if you look at the kind of emotional attachment that they have to what it is that they're doing, and you just compare it to the Nuremberg rallies, and you compare it to the dissatisfaction marches, when you see that kind of they were progressives. You have to understand that the Nazi movement was what we would call today the progressive movement. They have the same psychological profile. They have the same ethos. They have the same worldview. They don't want democratic accountability. They don't want the electorate to bear any burden. They just want to be delivered justice, social justice conferred on their identity. They want to be paternalized, according to some great, fatalistic destiny of a kind of a justice that makes sense. They want to be encapsulated in a narrative similar to the kind of the feudal worldview, basically. Oh, yeah, now I'm kind of getting a bit too fragmented, but I did want to make a point. I did have a train of thought that went into this quite nicely, although I'm not going to be able to replicate that, which has to do with how it's weird how these activists, these so-called radical revolutionary people, are in such deep sympathy with a centralized concentration of power, with the idea that it's going to be done for their benefit, that the right political elite is going to be in power, and the unwillingness to grapple with the real issues directly in a sustainable way. They just want someone who will blame the right people on behalf of the collective. And then if they fail, then they have all the tools, essentially, to conceal their ideological insufficiency and just double down and explain how they were infiltrated and how they did not accomplish their dreams because they didn't realize how toxic it was for them to, so you can really start to see the emergence of the kind of black nationalist rhetoric that was, exactly how the Jews and the Nazis, it's weird because you see, like when you have such vilification, it's very hard to justify not actually, let's say, driving towards a final solution. But the closer you are to completely being in control, the less ideological control you have over your own population, because then you don't have any more excuses. So, that's problematic, fundamentally. Because then there's no way to scapegoat, there's no way to divert the pressure, it's funny, but there's already such a high level of this that is being like the cognitive dissonance and repression of the failures of a corrupt government that is using a very cynical strategy of racial scapegoating, um, and a complete, sort of a very selective memory and record of events. Um, and somehow the only history that's relevant in this country is things that happened before 1994, when actually we have to consider that, in terms of the political reality of this country, that if we had just refocused our attention to things and how and why they happened after 1994, we could potentially be in a much stronger position, instead of the continued sabotage, which has a very low efficiency rate of even enriching the people relative to the general destruction that is wrought on the economy and the future of the people of this country, effectively just to facilitate redistribution of justice, uh, as a kind of unsustainable engine of revenge. It's sort of, which is, I mean, there's no getting around it. I mean, that's effectively what social justice is. It's in terms of how it's used and how it's conceived of, in terms of correlating things between the past and the present. There is no way to absolve the moral injustices of the past. There is only ameliorating the actual effects. And if we were actually serious about ameliorating those effects and doing something about those disadvantages, we would be realistic, instead of experimental, because you have all this freedom to be experimental at the expense of your scapegoat, of your captive scapegoat. And we have suffered from the political machination, that political device, which has been wholly adopted and championed, by what can only be said as disgusting institutional betrayal of the Constitution. And we have to realize that our universities have basically failed us. The Constitutional Court has failed the country, has failed the Constitution. It is effectively in league with a corrupt government. I don't know what you can even do to sort of and there's no credible political force that is even uh, the opposition has bought into identity consciousness. They are playing the same racialist pride, revenge, mechanic of fixing society, vehicle of fixing society. I mean, I do want to maybe make more clear recordings where I'm just talking about, let's say, the historical reality of South Africa and the ideological interpretation, just as a kind of, as a historical record, to have at least a benchmark or some. I want there to be a good assessment of this, so that when it all goes horribly wrong, and because the writing is already on the wall, but when it completely breaks down and disintegrates, that we can see exactly why. We can know why. And we can trace the toxic elements of ideology and the real people, the real villains that have arrested the development of a country merely because of their obsession with revenge, effectively, but also for obviously self-enrichment, because there's a lot of um, there's a lot of personal power that is enhanced in terms of the elites, the politi- the the greedy caste of political elites that are given this unaccountable power, which all of their wrongs effectively just get diverted via the ideological sausage machine into, well, it was, what do you expect? This should have, this is what needs to happen after apartheid. Like, we need a moral cleansing. We need a reverse apartheid. We need a racialist agenda to bring equilibrium. All this kind of completely antithetical policy and legal interpretation and legal theory. It completely turns the Constitution on its head, and the kind of disgusting judgments that have come out of the Constitutional Court. You can see this in terms of how they interpreted hate speech, and how they have created an ideological machine of creating these objective features about what things mean, that have completely displaced the individual sphere with a kind of orthodoxy. And part of that orthodoxy is this promulgated investment in revising history via the present. And everyone is enforced to playing their part, to being the token of that. To, they must be part of this collective process of a kind of worldly redemption of the history itself, which is, it can only be described as a false religion. This is, very analogous to the mark of the beast. Everyone must take the mark of their identity, which they're going to be politically expected to correlate to, that you have this, it's a very strange thing. People should have picked it up, that why is it that political correctness is connected with history? Why does the notion of political correctness, how is that directly tethered to historical features? How arbitrary can that be? The idea that you're going to have some kind of reactive historical sympathy, that you're going to sort of, which again means that somehow we all share the same past, we all share the same collective whatever, we all share the same collective group, we are part of our group story, we are a representative of a faction, we are all just parts of what must then come to represent them, mascots and Führers and tokens. And then some people will be appropriate tokens and some people will be outliers, and they will sort of the whole thing is so feeble. It really does devolve into the Lord of the Rings, with the 7 rings for the dwarves and the 9 rings for the men, and the 5 rings for the elves. What was it? if you don't have these stable subcategories even, um, I mean, the whole thing is just a complete insoluble mess. I mean, it's impossible to be resolved. You have to treat people in such a dehumanized way in order to just to get this very shitty paradigm off the ground. Just so, and the only excuse that it has is that no, it's actually useful. It actually will actually solve the problem. It's like this is the way to make things better, and it's not. It's a diversion. It makes you do the wrong thing. It makes you tackle the problem in the wrong way. In fact, it forces you to do it in the wrong way, in an unsustainable way, because then it makes the system more uncomfortable, which means that the system has been developed and changed. And so it becomes so inefficient that it can't even sustain this. And so it basically self-agonizes. Also because when it immediately supposedly helps people, it helps them in such a backwards way, in that everyone else must absorb this huge amount of incongruity because it's completely sensitive to the victim and insensitive to everyone who isn't the victim, that it's so inorganic, that it creates so much disruption, that it makes those people stigmatized, and that stigmatization then just amps up the narcissistic injury. And it's like, well, you see, they're not making me feel that this is natural, because so somehow it's the system's fault for not making the unnatural adaptation and intervention within the system feel natural. So that unnaturalness must be internalized as a collective systemic guilt, and to compensate for the systemic oppression. It really is a machine of an utter, you know, it, what really identity consciousness really is it's the excuse for the individual to belong to a collective psychopath, effectively, that you are allowed to, as a collective, you're allowed to exert these pressures and these powers, but it's not obvious when that's appropriate unless your group has actually got a grievance. So people look for a grievance or something that's symbolic of the grievance. They interject with their pushback, with their righteous indignation, and now they are representing a whole block of people beyond them, beyond themselves. And they're not just talking to an individual, they're talking to a representation of a whole group of people that are the problem, the systemic problem. And so, yeah, I mean, this is embarrassing. I can't remember this philosopher's name, but there was that French guy who talks about him a lot. Oh my word, this is so embarrassing. Peter Thiel talks about him all the time. The mimetic guy, mimicry, and such. This really gets into it. Christianity at its core, in its sort of in its mystical interpretation, not in the sort of the general common understanding of a kind of narrative version of Christianity, but in terms of the pure doctrine, which is very easily translated into a secular creed of morality. I mean, it's very close to atheism in some sense, in many respects. Once you fully cash it out, its substance, but the kind of what you see happening in terms of the crucifixion, that the whole thing with identity consciousness is really the inversion of that. It's really the exact opposite, which, okay, this is perhaps too tangential for people to follow me, but in 1 John chapter 4, when it talks about the Antichrist, the definition of the Antichrist, and whereof ye have heard that it should come, and even now already is it in the world. It's a very interesting sort of when it says it should come, it's referring effectively to Jesus Christ, which is also so an antichrist is someone who believes that Jesus Christ should come, and even now already is it in the world, which is almost in the phrase of a question. So they question if Jesus Christ is in the world or not. That is effectively, again, this requires a kind of doctrinal dissemination to fully get with what I'm talking about. But essentially, when it's referring to Jesus Christ, it's not referring to a person. It's referring to the spiritual name, the actual the spiritual entity, which is something like the condition of the unadulterated mind is Jesus Christ. Your mind is the only begotten Son of God. That is sort of the doctrinal message at its core. And that's also why in 1 John chapter 4, it says that Jesus Christ is come. It doesn't use the past tense. It uses the present tense. It uses the infinitive, in fact. So it's always here is the point. It's also worth perhaps pointing out that in 1 John chapter 5, it says very clearly that essentially God is an understanding, and so is eternal life, is merely an understanding. It's a structure within the mind. But anyway, I mean, I guess on some level people might complain that I'm being somewhat hypocritical, complaining that social identity consciousness is a religion, but and then talking about religious opposition to it. But I think it is actually appropriate because it is a religion. It should take religious criticism specifically, and in fact, sadly, only a kind of religious framework is one, or at least a comprehensive moral schema is capable of actually contending with it, because it basically just it table thumps its articles of faith. It is a blind religion. It is identity consciousness is a false religion, because it's based on these promises about the future. It has heard that something should come, when it really is asking it into being in the world constantly. You know, it's sort of like it's a convoluted thing of having erroneous expectations, which lead to an external authority, which lead to a future expectation to validate the continuing framework. You know, it's this really it's not a self-contained position, basically, which is why essentially it has to kind of be codependent with something that it's kind of extracting integrity from. It's kind of stealing a form of a grounding of value, because it can only generate its own values by resistance. It doesn't have a positive framework. It only has a negative framework of disagreement and complaint, effectively. So it needs something to complain against and to extract and reconstruct its values from. But if it stops having that resistance, then it's pretty unsustainable itself. But even in its own in the sense that it is creating reactive structures, though those reactive structures are also fundamentally unsustainable. And the heavier they get, the more they get, the more unwieldy they become. Um, because they intersect each other very uncomfortably, and the only way to sort them out coherently is to fundamentally threaten the whole formula in some sense. And so you have to quite craftily just sort of keep on changing the window dressing, keep on altering the descriptions, and trying to create a larger labyrinth of and so this is what generally happens in positivistic legal frameworks that existed, for example, in Nazi Germany, and which is developing in countries, in a lot of countries, although in a lot of countries, these positivistic frameworks, the law itself was already congruent with positivism because of essentially the Napoleonic influence in law. Napoleon's general system of statecraft has corrupted most legal systems. The only legal system that actually has a different way of doing these things is South Africa, because we effectively are the only country that still have Roman law. And we run on general principles of law. Everything is derived from general principles, which means that you can actually have a human integrity and a human morality which is evolving in pace with human discerning, effectively, that it organically develops via the mechanism of the common law, effectively, but from the basis of general principles. So it's a kind of, it does have elements of the British common law, but because of the general principles, it actually has a firmer internal compass of that it must be holistically coherent. And so it actually is a holistic enterprise and project on discovering, a stable morality that isn't, so it's a good humanistic sort of project to have, if I can put it like that. Although what I just mentioned could be extended into a longer dissertation. That's a point that's worth getting into, but and that would have to do with, for example, how Jung described introverted feeling, that effectively introverted feeling is something that needs to be almost like it is almost where civilization and civility was developed within introverted feeling. And to the extent to which we have a community which has somewhat an agreement in introverted feeling in terms of having a commonly contended and developed system of introverted feeling, allows us to more transparently communicate and facilitate interrelatedness and facilitate collaboration, negotiation, have more clearly defined forms of contract in terms of facilitating people in making intricate, forms of innovative devices of contendering and furthering their own purposes. Anyway, and there's probably a bit of a better thing to be said about introverted feeling as well, but sort of on that point, but what else should be said? Oh, and then this is a bit of a tangent completely, and an addendum to something that I said in, I think, the last recording when I was talking about the British parliamentary system being better than the South African parliamentary system. I mean, it is in some sense, it is hard to dispense with the kind of the naturalistic clarity that the general framework of the British system delivers. By not having a constitution and by having a supreme parliament, it then emphasizes the responsibility that is placed in the electorate to be accountable for their own government, in some sense, to be accountable for deciding on who will be their government. And it also means that the culture of the people that is inherited within the representatives chosen from the people within the Houses of Parliament, that then that culture becomes the kind of the most important. It becomes a very important point because that culture itself represents the limits. You know, it forces a level of sophistication, because you can't just merely say these things are governed. That some issues have been taken out of politics, that because everything is still to play for. The culture that determines what is proper and improper, or what is what is out of bounds, and what is argumentative, is something that has to be constantly read or monitored by the culture itself. And so, you know, the British political system has been vibrant to that extent, and then it's also developed very sophisticated technical precedents that the speaker, in terms of how the speaker manages all the different kinds of sittings that occur in the Parliament. So with the recognition that Parliament is supreme, and so those rules are a very interesting canon, effectively. Also because they're effectively they're substantially nebulous, and so all this nebulousness effectively equates to a kind of responsibility which becomes inseparable from the cultural project itself, or the development of culture, because it is in some sense an inculcation of the adherence to culture. And so their culture is quite vibrant in that sense. Whereas when you've got a system of ostensibly an edifice of things that have been taken out of politics, but actually no, it seems now it lulls people. Oh no, that's not exactly quite the point, but I guess because the Constitution has already been so badly interpreted and betrayed by the Constitutional Court, it's very hard to envisage how the Speaker of Parliament would protect the Constitution in terms of the kind of assault that it has endured in terms of the black fascists that both exist within the ANC government and within the EFF, which we must always remember was pretty much the EFF is almost the progeny of the ANC, as the leader of the EFF was the former ANC Youth League president. Um, and their politics, there are more radical uh, national socialists within the ANC than even the EFF. And the kind of the weird sort of occult esoteric identity stuff already has it started to seep into the culture. You can really start to feel it, and you also see a lot of it. Because once you start having this identity consciousness, it really begs to be kind of encapsulated into a esoteric pantheism. The kind of that our blood needs a destiny, it needs a place to go. And so as soon as you've kind of got that, the only kind of activism or progress that then naturally follows from that is, well, what's holding us back, which is effectively a kind of cannibalism, a kind of, because that is effectively the revenge solution that identity consciousness offers, is that our 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 fate has been displaced by other people's injustice, so we should unjustly displace their uh, their role until we are made whole and we have extracted the justice that we were deprived of from history. I mean, does it really even have to be pointed out the huge obsession with the Nazis and the Jewish conspiracies, which were reinvented many times, that even after all the Jews were locked up in the ghettos, they were still complaining that their minds had been corrupted and that the Jewish conspiracy was quite um, was quite a subtle thing that had corrupted people and infiltrated people's uh, um, and this is exactly how whiteness is defined by these racial theorists. This is exactly the kind of hysterical narrative incepting. I mean, it's a fact. The proponents of these kinds of ideology, especially in that kind of academic circle. I mean, it's very strange because they don't make clear arguments. Apart from table thumping, a kind of saying things that resonate with the premises, which are never articulated um, openly. That somehow talking about history is the hypothesis. Talking about history in such a poetical way becomes the hypothesis. They don't have to make an argument, it's just taken to be self-evident. But this only works when you are being spoken to by people who have the vestments of authority, a kind of traditional authority. These are academics, these are considered to be wise people, and they really play no different part than, for example, those crazy groups, like the KKK and their grand wizard dragon people. These are the same figures. they do the same thing. They share the same role. In America, this is generally how the Democratic Party has always organized its sort of its worldview and promulgated its groupthink, and which famously they've always been hugely sympathetic with the Nazis and the Nazi style of politics. The Kennedys famously. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. Oh, I'm definitely going to add this little addendum onto the last sort of rambling on psychology and politics, because I just wanted to discuss the cultural appropriateness of someone like Trump. So, Trump has his own personal style, right? He has his own style of personality, and it's tremendously fitting. He's the exact kind of leader that you would want facing this really strange kind of um, subtle racialist ideological stuff, which is the pseudo intellectualism that's based into like Nazi type identity consciousness, into the social justice movement, that's baked into the social justice movement. It's very hard to confront. The only thing that can really stand up against it is something that is treating everything as an individual, that is actually contending their own subjective perspective authentically, right? And so Trump is like that. He is, at least, he is honest in his report of what it is subjectively like for him to contend with the things that he's contending with. He might exaggerate, but he's doing so in order to sort of make a point, right? I've touched on the subject somewhat before. And, you know, the only thing that he can really use, because of his style of engagement, is basic principles. And the basic principles that he has available to him are, the obvious good ones that we had in the 90s, non racialism, for instance, just common sense kind of stuff, instead of this very pseudo intellectual systemic oppression interpretation and projection onto people. And what you want is someone who is very capable of tracking and monitoring what it means when people are engaging in the way that they are engaging. And so another way of agreeing with Trump's critics in some way, but also making the point that I'm making, is that yes, Trump is thin-skinned in this sense, in that he's sensitive, but that sensitivity is exactly what you need to sort of minesweep and to uncover all the fucking ideological booby traps, and someone who is articulating, at least in some form, the counter argument for the arguments that aren't even being posited by the other side, because they're just presumed. They're just begging the question of all this really toxic, systemic, collective guilt and collective responsibility kind of stuff. And then we also see, the kind of you can see how the environmentalism plays into this concentration and centralization of power, and disempowering, the citizenry of actually coming to some organic solution, instead of having this top-down approach to solving everything, so it's like it really is this false sense, the whole ideology of identity consciousness is that salvation can only come directed from the top down, that we need someone with coercive interventionist powers, to rule everything and to govern everything and to impose the solution, because the victims are just too weak to work around it, or something like that. And it's ironic because the more systemic sort of intervention that you have in your system, the more toxic consciousness you breed, and it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you want to look at South Africa as almost a case in point in terms of how running this ideology to the point at which you've sabotaged your own economy so that you can continue to push for radical concentration of centralized resource administration from a political um, administration, so it never ends. It's self-agonism, and it's completely blind to all the details that dismantle its very fragile, sort of simplified reduction of the problem, and therefore its reactive solution. It's such an emotionally charged and definitionally inducted structure of belief that isn't articulated, that isn't made by having an open hypothesis and an open argument, that it's so stupid. Because fundamentally, the idea that somehow by compensating people for history, that is the fastest way to make a difference in people's lives, it's just, all these things are just assumed, they're just sort of, they're not even spoken out loud. There's so many strange conflations and convoluting, that you need someone who is sensitive, who takes it personally, who takes being projected on personally. Let me find, there was a what I would call a very good summary of this in a response that I made. Oh yeah, it's on my phone. Okay, forgive the language. maybe I'll also find a way to cut out this silence in the recording. But so what is this in oh yeah, okay, well, I'm not going to say exactly what this is a response to, but you can sort of imagine. So this is just a comment on an anonymous forum. I said, you guys have drunk the Kool-Aid. You don't know anything about political ideology. You've been indoctrinated by shitty American college professors. Fascism has always been clothed in left-wing rhetoric, no exception. Do you even know what Nazi stands for? Your identity politics, racism, has made you blind to the fact that a non-racialist discourse that Trump represents is the only thing keeping Western culture still going right now. Your totalitarian narrative is the radical fascistic poison that forces people to engage with it, and then you label them racist or nationalistic because they don't want systemic interventions and a false religion administering over public life, and collapsing interpersonal relations into collective claims of narcissistic injury. Stop projecting onto Trump just to make your narrative stay true. And then I said, stupid mainstream tards, as the sort of the final epithet. Yeah, I think it's a good sort of condensed position. Um, Trump is very good at deranging the ideology that is opposed to him and that is trying to scapegoat him to serve their very fragile ideological narrative. And so, and that really has to do with Trump's personality style, which is, which has these components in it, which that he exaggerates, but he doesn't exaggerate, he exaggerates in order to emphasize the principle of the matter that is his defense, that is what he is working within, that is his, that is what is covering his behavior, because his behavior is, in his personal style, it's laissez-faire. It's as he so wishes, as what he wants to do, but what he wants to do has to conform at some level to some kind of propriety. It has to be limited in some sense. He has to, in order to do something extravagant, you have to know something about where the lines are, so that when you creatively, kind of exaggerate things to try and be as creative as you want to be, so that you can put your own personal flair on it, then you know exactly how you have, you end up knowing quite well your own intentions and why you have a personal subjective account as to how you have navigated in your own unique style. And so as an individual who is fundamentally not conforming to an ideology that requires him to take on a kind of systemic collective responsibility and a collective guilt, according to this pervasive orthodoxy narrative, when he, Trump, is contending his own responsibility. He is responsible for expressing and maintaining his own set of responsibilities, which he wants to be the communicator of. He doesn't want other people to communicate on his behalf. So that's the kind of authenticity. It's an individualistic authenticity. It's an interpersonal kind of basis of reality, that he is the promulgator of reality. And if you want to, you actually have to contend with him directly if you want to try and strip him of his postulated sense of well-being, and his postulated personal choice of expression. So he is effectively just being, it's somewhat in league also. It's almost so common sense, but there's nothing there's nothing beyond the pale in terms of fundamentally what Trump represents in terms of his personality. It's almost fundamentally, quintessentially American. He is an opinionated American that is sort of, the pursuit of happiness and liberty and such. And because he does that, he has to be very careful at having an account of how he has navigated himself. And so he will use that account to defend himself. And that makes him seem thin-skinned because he's doing it his way. And people are allowed to do it their way. And he's having to be compared against this bank of conventions, a lot of which are stale, stereotypical projections, and the whole ideology that he's up against that's all it is. It's just basically everyone is only allowed to be a stereotype, and they must represent only what that narrative says that they represent, and all you have to do is basically speak that narrative at people abjectly, and Trump will not be spoken at in such a way. He will speak right back at you. Instead of being the wounded conservative who perhaps is also averse to the kind of systemic narrative, although there are some elements of traditionalism which is kind of toxic. There are some kinds of it depends how fatalistic you are, but if you're a kind of libertarian-minded conservative, which most, I think, of the Republican Party is generally moralistically resonant in that sense. They talk about the American identity, but they don't actually mean the American identity. They mean the ideals that underpin it. They mean the principles, and these are effectively universal values in some sense. And then they have, let's say, the rhetoric that they have a special pride that those values have been successful and have been shown to be, expressed and enjoyed in that particular place. But it's not like the land is magical, although the rhetoric, I guess it can be read that way, but it's specifically read that way by people who simply are in the contest of narratives, and they just want their counter narrative, and in fact their counter narrative depends on a narrative to react to. So the one thing you do is you deflate the narrative. I'm just talking tactically. So this, I think, is what Trump has. This is why he tends to win against them, is because he doesn't fight them so hard with a counter narrative. He doesn't try to counter their counter narrative. He deflates the picture that he is representing a counter narrative by representing the underlying values and principles. So he is being a champion of, inverted commas, Western values, which he himself is a pretty good personal representation of, in terms of how it matches up against this very vile remnant of what you could only call Nazi philosophy, the systemic oppression and systemic racism. That kind of story cannot be, it's defined into reality. They don't even make a proper argument. They just have correlations of data and then a historical narrative which they just keep on table thumping and repeating ad nauseum. And insofar as that historical narrative is projected onto the president and projected onto the president in general, but onto the president as a kind of scapegoat, as the representative scapegoat, he is very good at defending and debunking and sort of deflating, because, in some sense, they can only have a credible counter-narrative if they have a static narrative to be the counteraction thereof. They are fundamental. You people have to understand that these people the progressives, they are like the Nazi movement. There's no difference in ideology. Um, but because Trump is a moving target, he's not giving them a narrative that they can hang their counteraction to, that they can be reactionary about. So they don't know what to be reactionary about. They can't make their reactionary position look credible, because it only effectively. I mean, Trump is communicating in some sense via narrative, but because the substance is changing, but it's changing according to a very clear formula, which is very easy to read and monitor within Trump's consistency, because the consistency is in the values, right? So because Trump is effectively using the values to defend, against this very toxic form of ideological assault and complaining, um, the substance changes, he's saying different things all the time, but he's representing the same values, and the reactionary counter narrative has nothing to sink its teeth into. It's sort of, so it's a thirsty vampire, and so then they just keep on looking like the thirsty vampire that gets more and more desperate, trying to kind of create a stable narrative. And then it's funny that essentially, because they don't have a stable target, they complain essentially that they aren't being given the thing that they are allowed to easily complain about. That it's not convenient for their ideology. Yeah, and again, this really all hinges on Trump's particular personality, which is I can only describe as a godsend, because it does debunk this fascist political development, which is so toxic, because it will proliferate and cause balkanization. Because I mean, eventually, the stronger it gets, the more, if it ever gets in charge of policy and it gets in charge of creating differential compensatory outcomes, it creates such a toxic identity consciousness that people eventually, they can't stand to live side by side. They can't stand to occupy the same space, because there's too much narcissistic injury being projected, and there's too much tokenism and forcing people to be representative of roles, and then effectively you have to develop something like what Trump is like, just to try and have a sense of interpersonal reality that's authentic, rather than being forced to live in this orthodox narrative of this very depressing identity matrix, with its, it's sort of, I mean, look, I mean, Hitler technically would have called these people, technically these progressives, they aren't Nazi supporters, they are Nazi dupes. Hitler would have called them useful idiots, because they spread fascistic values and they spread the fascistic worldview. And they haven't yet made the one final compromise, which is that the understanding that power and centralized administration of power can only serve one identity. They haven't come to that one piece of the puzzle yet. So they think that identity is the way to go, that the way to protect yourself in life is to look at everyone's identity and work out fairness between identities, because that's the way to administer politics and society. But as soon as you've got that in your moral system, you're fucked. You are fascist scum. Like you are just treating people like fucking racialized, categorized objects. It's the most deplorable. And this is what they call woke. This is what they call it, to be enlightened. It's so disgusting. And effectively, then all the solutions to all the problems is just administration from the top down. Is just we need a Führer, we need a savior, we need Russell Brand, to tell us how we need to absorb more collective guilt and collective responsibility for things. It's just. And because, those pseudo-intellectuals aren't really capable of, really grappling with an argument, because they never make an argument to begin with, they just presume everything definitionally into their narrative to begin with. Trump really is the model of the appropriate counter-treatment. Because the more you try to reason with these people, it just doesn't work. You can't actually... I actually have... I'm going to try to find this other response that I made. Let me try to find this quickly. What was that video called? Not that. Okay, I think this is it. Okay, this is a comment that I made on a video by Rebel Wisdom. The video is titled "The Science of Psychology and Polarization, Part 1 of 4." My comment reads as follows: the so-called left, who are really holders of fascist ideology, invented the introduction of safety as an issue, as the platform for an insulated, in brackets, and self-fulfilling political critique. It is true that this tactic is infectious and is model of a narcissistic personality style, which can also be molded by an opposition as a way to reflexively insulate against its toxic outreach, and thus you get the proliferation of narcissistic psychopathy on a group level, which was effectively Hitler's masterful control of the public discourse through what he labeled as useful idiots, which are today's progressives. The vector for the contagion of fascistic values and ideology. The issue of safety is itself a toxic issue, because more than this, because the more that this central narrative... Okay. The issue of safety... I'm just going to start again. The issue of safety is itself a toxic issue, because the more that the central narrative is fed, the more legitimacy is provided into the proto-fascist discourse. Sadly, I don't think there is a way to engage with fascist ideologues. Their insulation is finely tuned, and they will create moral codes and regulatory reactions which will label any imposition of doubt as a threat to safety. They are the representatives of the socially successful paranoid. They conceal their obnoxious bigotry in a defensive veneer of stereotypical thinking. They believe in identity with its complement of symbolic justice. You cannot converse with people who are inherently goats. They belong to their groupthink. They are marked by their own labeling, and the constant resistance they would extract from you in order just to avoid their matrix domain, which I guess I mean in terms of their own sense of captivity within their own narrative, would already prove to them that your intentions were to infect them with what they label as racism or white supremacy, inverted commas. They are lost. They do not know what life is. Leave them to their way, solve other problems without them, and exclude them if they cannot develop commensurable relations to the living. You cannot convert them by pandering into their toxicity. So that is the fundamental problem, is that engagement is really, I don't, like, in some sense you can perhaps attempt to engage them and show that, and then have a kind of monologue discourse that you present in some public, to make a video about it. You can show trying to have a conversation with them, and then having a kind of commentary about it, showing, their toxic and feeble attempts at essentially just assuming that everyone is prone to their causative narrative, and they don't have a defense of that causative narrative. They just assume that it just must be given the prominence. It's just an abject table thump. It's just a sort of abject power grab. And then they've just got hysterical, emotional, kind of anecdotal charge to kind of back up their arguments. They have found the ideology that really taps right into that sense of conditioning, of that you're fighting your own conditioning and thus reifying it also, and not having any sense of actual real reality, and actually how to change real reality, because the only entities which are being respected as having a kind of distinct moral consideration or a distinct integrity are these very abstract groups, which are the foremost, components and vehicles of society. They are the foremost children. They are the so right at the start you have this automatic, like, I've inherited my worldly identity, and now I wear it reactively, and that is how I promulgate social justice. It's this very self-sympathizing, self-referencing, abject table thumping, basically. And because you're already entracted into that quite intractable and insoluble sort of conundrum, you are constantly just hypnotized about these historical stories, which you are a part of this historical story process, and so it's this weird kind of collective storytelling, which is effectively, that is the core of a fascistic culture, that you pick an author, an authoritative narrator, and you say, he is going to narrate the fate of my people, and he is going to save the fate of my people, or he or she or whatever. But you can't get away from it. At some point you have to sort of designate mascots so that they can actually have some kind of exchange between one another, so that they can be some kind of firm, agreed sense in which social justice has been facilitated, which means that everyone has to get into their camp, everyone has to line up according to the narrative, and eventually you get to the idea that, well, then we should really have ethno-states, we should really actually be in different places, we should segregate, we should separate, because otherwise the ideology just kind of, it's unworkable, and eventually you get to the point, well, actually it's very hard to have a shared political community that has more than one of these identities, because they are fundamentally, they have a different moral consideration that attaches to them, that they collectively bear. So, you're already projecting onto people a kind of a strange amount of significance, a strange, it's like an unknown quantity of tokenistic, symbolic justice, which effectively can only be triggered legitimately by immediately taking on this kind of narcissistic injury and asserting it in the immediate discourse. And so that's why you get what looks like very delusionally, mentally ill people essentially feeding their autistic sentimentality and their insulated sense of a kind of collective armor, um, which effectively, if you criticize them, if you do anything that they interpret as negative, it's happening against their group. It's not happening against them. It's happening against them as a representative of their group. So there's no interpersonal dimension that exists. It's just completely collapsed. So you've collapsed civil society, and you've just got identitarian fascistic values running amok. And that mentality doesn't even work. Even if you get everyone on the same page and you force everyone to be on the same page because you've got your ideological police, you've got your Gestapo, you've got thought crime in effect, it still doesn't work. But without that promulgated, everyone must toe the line, we all have the same hate speech codes. If you don't have the hate speech code stuff in force, it threatens the viability of the ideology at its core. So all the way that they're doing this, they're constantly generating legal arguments as to how the state must be corrupted to facilitate the ideology. This is fascistic legal positivism. We've already seen it. They've already erected their their university kangaroo courts to persecute rape accusations. So you've already got this complete breakdown of gender relations, from these false rape culture. I mean, the whole thing is a complete fabrication, because if you don't have that kind of hysterical safety scare, you don't have the excuse to change the rules, And so it's strange, because the violence that they complain about is not real violence. It's, inverted commas, the real violence of being interrupted when you're a woman because you are a woman, which is subjectively, thumb sucked, because they don't know the difference, because everything that's ever happened to them has only happened to them because of their group designation according to their subjective interpretation. It's a self-referential and then they can say something about, well, the history is that men have subjugated women, so that is it just confirms my anecdotal complaint and projection onto you. So, these people, there's no point in directly talking to them. You're not going to help them. You're not going to, they were not argued into the position that they hold, because it's not based on an argument. It's just a formulaic narrative reduction of everything into this, what I just call the causal narrative. So they don't use reason to look at, cause-effect relationships, so that they can't be creative with cause and effect. They can only look at the narrative, and everything must be reduced into a narrative and competing narratives and a competition of narratives. And so there's no it's just basically a power grab. These people are vacuous, hollow souls, and they will not be happy until they, inverted commas, representatively control the system, or, inverted commas, have their part of the equilibrium that is social justice, So it's, on some abstract level, they are only asking for their fair share. But because it's so incoherently constructed and insane, and because they can just keep on generating more and more descriptions about injustice, about complaining about the complexities, about how this doesn't meet up to their ideological standards. It's interesting, because all of those things are just essentially there to destabilize the system. They're there to literally to prove the ideology correct. So it's sort of like they want them to put in measures that will be bad measures that don't work, because that will be the evidence to indict the entire system with. So it's like listening to them is what creates the problem, which then proves their ideology. It's because it's a circular, self-referencing, self-agonizing, disgusting ethos. This is the pseudo-intellectualism of fascism, and we've got them in our universities, we've got them on our radio stations, promulgating this ideology. And they've got the constitutional court, and we're going to start having hate speech legislation where you won't be able to tackle the ideology. Power has just cut because the government stole too much money from building power stations, and like all the other state-owned enterprises, they're on the verge of bankruptcy and need another bailout, which the country now can't afford because of just the general sabotage of the economy. Maladministration. But still, the biggest thing, that needs to be tackled somehow is white privilege. Yeah. So, this is an interesting diatribe. Basically, I'm saying don't engage with these people. It's worthless.